Assalamu alaikum and a good day to our viewers. We are back talking with Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy on his book, Pakistan, Origins, Identity and Future. We are now going to discuss the part 2 of the book, which is titled A Closer Look at Pakistan's Three Founding Heroes. This is not a hagiography, meaning ये कसीदा नहीं है. This is a scholar's critical look at Pakistan's three founding fathers, Sir Syed, Allama Iqbal and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. It tries to give a very rounded and a multi-dimensional picture of each of them. And in my opinion, it is based on extensive research and with citations and sources. So, Dr. Hoodbhoy, we will start and we will now be discussing the first founder hero or founding father, Sir Syed, who lived from 1817 to 1898. But before we discuss Sir Syed, please set the stage by describing the political, social and economic map of India and that of the Muslim community of his time.
Sir Syed lived at a time when the Muslims were not only in decline, but they had been in great distress. They were out of jobs, they could not compete with Hindus. Those who had ruled over India and felt a great sense of entitlement were now in a state of desperation. And it was particularly bad in Bengal, but it was also bad in UP, where Sir Syed was from. And in Delhi, there was a Mughal emperor until 1857, but he was there just in name, Bahadur Shah Zafar. He would write poetry and manage his harem, and he'd manage, the thousands of princes that were there, but he was confined within the walls of the his castle, of the Red Fort. Yeah. So Sir Syed grew up in a very conservative family, and they were beneficiaries of Mughal rule. They were in a state of depression. They knew that the future was not very good, and then comes along 1857, and the Muslims and Hindus of that area, they rise up together, but it's the Muslims who take the lead in this, and it is on them that the brute force of the British is exercised, and they are decimated. Delhi becomes ruins at that point. There are corpses on the street. It's a horror that Ghalib has actually very well captured.
That's right. He says Delhi was emptied of Muslims, and the aristocratic class fled. Everybody. This was for a few years that this emptied, 3-4 years, that there was no Muslim allowed.
In fact, because the British had been so badly damaged by this, there was a thought that they would bring in their heavy artillery and wipe out every single Muslim building that there was. And so there was a certain Lord Palmerston who said that this is now the need. Get the cannons before every heritage building from the time of Babur and Akbar and onwards, blow it to the ground. And it's only at the very last minute that that order was taken back. So this is the era in which Sir Syed grew up. Mm-hmm. They would get together in the evenings, and there would be these mushairas, and the mushairas would be all about self-flagellation and crying about past glories and wishing for the old times. There was a lot of nostalgia, but there was no way out that they could see. That's when it started to cross Sir Syed's mind that there's something deeply wrong.
So that's the environment in which he's now grown up as a man, observing post-87 India, which, as you called it, a total disaster. I mean, it was like our Holocaust at that point in India. But you call Sir Syed the lonely modernizer. Now, exactly what were his key achievements as a reformer, since you do call him a modernizer?
He wasn't always a modernizer. He was actually very, very conservative. He was under Wahhabi influence from the time that he was educated. He was educated at home. He never learned English in school. He was taught at home Persian, Arabic, Urdu, and taught the religious texts, memorized them, and he was actually then very fond of getting into religious arguments with people. Those zaman mein jo manazare hote the, he would participate in them. You know, his papers, his written papers from that era are so remarkable. The first paper he wrote was on the stationarity of the earth and the movement of the sun. And he actually argued that it is ridiculous.
He argued that in the 19th century. He's arguing that the earth is stationary and the sun revolves around the earth.
Yeah, I think he was 23, 24 years old when he wrote that. And he did it on the basis of the kind of logic, the Greek logic that existed at that time and that you find in classical Muslim scholars. Because you see, at that time, there was this debate going on in religious circles, who to believe. There's modern science which has come in, Galileo, who says that it's exactly the opposite is true, that it's the sun which is the center and the earth is going around it. So, where should we find the truth? And he says, find it in the Quran, and then he interprets the Quran in that way. But what's even more interesting, he came under the influence of Wahhabism. And in Wahhabi philosophy, in the Wahhabi way of looking at Islam, you do not do what the Holy Prophet has not done. Anything else is then biddat. We call it biddat in Urdu, in Arabic biddah. And so, this was a question, a serious question at that time, and this happened in one of his mahfils there, whether it is okay for a Muslim to eat mangoes or not. क्या आम खाना एक मुसलमान के लिए जायज़ है कि नहीं? And he actually wrote a 30-page paper on that, at the end of which he says, वो मुसलमान जो आम इसलिए नहीं खाता कि रसूल सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम ने आम नहीं खाए थे, यौम आखिरत के दिन फरिश्ते आकर उसके पाँव चूमेंगे.
So he begins from that kind of almost, unfortunately, the word I'll use, ignorant about where we are living and how we are interpreting the world. And then he moves from, how does he move from there to what you call a modernizer and a reformer? What's the journey?
So there is no clear indication in his biography by Maulana Hali, who was his very close friend and associate. But what happened was that he got a job with the British, and it was the company at that time, only the company, and they gave him the task of translating a science book, a book on physics, mechanics actually, translating from I think it was Farsi into Urdu, and it was some kind of a translation work, and that's where he first encountered science. And it set his mind in motion. This is something based on very logical principles. How is it all working? And that was the beginning of his transformation. And then he started learning English. Then he started looking around him and saying, and asking the question, what is it that Muslims are lacking? And he came to this conclusion that unless Muslims learn to move with the times, unless they learn English and unless they learn science, and he was particularly then impressed by the rationalism of Europe and the thoughts of the scientific revolution. So that's what started him on this road. But he was absolutely adamant that the only knowledge that exists that's now useful for Muslims is this. But he was also at the same time a very strong Muslim. And he said, what we need is a new theology. What we need is a new interpretation of the Quran similar to that of the Mu'tazila. In fact, some people call Sir Syed the modern Mu'tazila,
the rationalist
of Islam. And it's very interesting, some of the conclusions that he came to.
So this is very interesting. He is educated only in local vernaculars and languages and knowledge, gets a book of science and starts him thinking. This must have been a very, of course, intelligent human being, that it makes such a difference. And then he comes, as you said now, surprisingly, where he is now trying to reconcile the Quran with science. I mean, he's advocating modern education, and he is now saying that there's a primacy of reason and logic. All of a sudden, a change from somebody who said eating mangoes is not right, or who is arguing that the earth is stationary. What a revolutionary change in a human being. Wonderful.
Absolutely. And you can watch him through the various stages. So, for example, before he completely changed his mind, he wrote this very thick book called Asar-e Sanadid. And this was the achievements of the Mughal Empire in terms of their architecture, in terms of their literature, music, and means of governance, administration. After this, he sends this to Ghalib. Ghalib was the great guy of that time. Everybody thought of him as the poet par excellence. So he asked Ghalib to write its introduction, जिसे तकरीज कहते हैं. Well, Ghalib sent back a poem in Farsi, which actually I've reproduced in the book, which completely tore his book to pieces and made it look so puny and so insignificant.
So the title, the causes of Asnadid kya hai? What's the word? How would you translate it into English, the title of the book?
So it's Glories of the Past.
Glories of the Past. Achha. So and now why does Ghalib tear it to pieces?
He says, go look at the Sahibs of England. They make their cities bathe in light at night. They have a boat that works without oars and sails. They have done this, they have done that.
He says, forget the glories of the past, look at the glories of the present.
Look at the glories of the present and be aware of how technology and science have transformed the world. Why are you worrying about old times?
It's interesting because Ghalib, of course, was also a great modernist and a modern thinker, which we don't fully realize, but he was. So that's what's going on in terms of. Now, you said he got a job in the company, and then from there his evolution begins. how did he begin to see the British rule? What was his relationship with the British?
First of all, he was a job seeker. He got a job with the company. The company gave him assignments. He did those very well. He was then rewarded with rapid promotion. He rose in the estimation of his bosses. Then he was assigned in 1857, just as this just as the war broke out. He was assigned to a place close by Delhi, and there, when news reached about this rebellion, he took it upon himself to protect the British. So in fact, he would personally patrol with his gun in hand and walk around and make sure that nobody would harm the British who were living over there. So he completely put his sympathies and his service in the hands of the British, for which he was amply rewarded. And so a lot of people say, oh, but he was nothing but a British stooge. Well, he also said a lot of things. He said that I cannot foresee I cannot foresee an India where the British are not there. I hope they will remain here forever. We are like animals compared to them. He said all these things, yes. But fundamentally, at his heart was to serve the Ashrafia, the elite Muslims of his time. And that he did by emphasizing the importance of modern knowledge. In that, he was unique. That's why my title for the chapter is The Lonely Modernizer. Among Hindus, you have lots of them. There are lots of Raja Ram Mohan Roys over there. But among Muslims, if you ask,
there was no one.
Who was there? There's only one big name that crops up, and that's him.
That's him. So in other words, we have to be very thankful in a way that he opened the shut doors for the Muslim elite at that time, and therefore, in a way, for all of us. Would you say that Sir Syed is the creator of the two-nation theory?
Well, not right away. Eventually, so there are two phases to Sir Syed. There is the phase in which he is absolutely open-minded, in which he says Hindus and Muslims are brothers. They're like the two eyes of a beautiful bride. They are, and in one place he is very offended when the Hindus don't acknowledge him as their friend and leader. He says, but I am proud to be a Hindu myself. So he says a lot of things.
So this is his beginning in communal terms. He didn't see, he was at that point not a communalist, but somebody who was, if you will, saw himself as an Indian, similar to, in a way, long after Muhammad Ali Jinnah called the ambassador of unity between Hindu and Muslim. So this is where Sir Syed also starts from, by seeing himself identified with the majority.
Yes, but let me qualify that.
Okay.
He fought for not all Muslims, but for the Muslim elite. And he did not like Bengalis at all. In fact, he made such overtly racist statements, and he said, I would much rather be friends with the Hindus than with Bengalis, because Bengalis they're not a people of dignity. They are, today what he said about Bengalis, he says they are cowards. Soon as they hear a loud sound, they dive under the table. Would you ever want them to be the rulers of India? No, it is we Muslims who have shown our greatness.
Very similar prejudice to what existed in West Pakistan against Bengalis of East Pakistan. I mean, we used to also have that kind of caricature.
Absolutely. So he caricatured the Bengalis in his own way, and he thought of himself as somebody who belonged to the upper class of society, and the upper class, he was happy with Hindus of the upper class, but he said of the others, the Bhils and the Kamis and all that, they are not even humans.
No.
You can't even think of them as humans. So his two nations at that point was, it's the rich and everybody else.
Or the nobility and
The nobility and-
the nobility and everybody else.
Yes.
Okay. So,
But
yeah.
he did change.
Ah.
He changed after the Congress came into existence, and the political movement started to fight against the British. And Sir Syed was fully with the British. He did not envisage an India without the British. He did not want them to go, and the Congress was making mischief. So here was somebody who gave great worth to Hindus, never thought of himself as a communalist. But then they started changing, and it started changing after the Congress came into existence. What did the Congress want? The British to go away. And this was exactly the opposite of what Sir Syed wanted. He wanted the British to stay there forever and ever, because he never thought that the locals could ever be capable of self-rule. So at that point the conflict began, but then it became even more intense because he had started a scientific society, and there was a journal over there, and it was in Urdu. That journal was in Urdu, but then he appointed an editor who said, but most people in India speak Hindi, so should we have this in Hindi? And at that point, the Hindi-Urdu thing started, and this then developed further and further into a schism. That's the beginning of his communalism, and then his definition of Qawm started changing. Then he said, we Muslims are the Qawm, and it is us whose interests have to be protected.
So from we, the nobility, are the real McCoys, to we, the Muslims, now become the nation. So there is a communalism that starts at that point. So there are still, you discussed that even though as a modernizer, as a reformer, he still had blind spots and contradictions in his modernizing vision. What would those be?
Well, he was totally opposed to the idea of women liberation. He believed in parda. He thought that women should not get educated. So, although here is a man who says that education is the way forward, but the education is for males only. And he was very misogynist in his attitudes, which is why a lot of feminists don't like him. Of course, leftists don't like him because he's so totally in favor of the elite. But you know, one thing that we should acknowledge was that he reinterpreted Muslim theology to be consistent with modernity. And in that process, he developed a lot of resistance from ordinary Muslims, and in particular from the clergy. In terms of the new ideas that he brought, I think those are unparalleled. We have not seen a reformer on the Indian subcontinent who has been bolder than Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So he starts reinterpreting the Quran, writing a Tafhim al-Quran, And he does it in the light of science and rationality. How? He has a way of doing that. First, he says you have to look at every word of Arabic and get its context and what it meant at that time back in the past. And then you have to reinterpret everything so that it is consistent with modern science. So he takes the starting point. This is the word of God, Kalam-e-Ilahi. But then it's got to be understood in a way so that it's consistent with modern science. And if there is a contradiction, and there are many contradictions, he says, then you choose science over what's there in the book.
That's truly the Ibn Rushd way of thinking, isn't it?
Oh,
that
yeah,
if there is a conflict between scripture and reason, then reason prevails.
Yes, but at the time of Ibn Rushd, there was not the scientific revolution.
Right.
You see, this comes after that.
After that.
Yeah. So, what do you do with miracles? Did the moon split when the prophet pointed towards it? Did man emerge from Adam and Eve? Well, remember, this is the time of Darwinian evolution in England.
Yeah.
And Sir Syed had gone to England at about that time. He was contemporaneous with Darwin. That's very, it's something quite remarkable. And he saw the debates that were going on in Darwinism, the Huxley versus the Bishop debates over there, Bishop Wilberforce. He was very taken in by those debates. He said, this is the way to decide upon scientific matters. So he comes out with this prescription. He says, if you see science in contradiction with what's there in the Quran, you take science, because these are stories, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of the great flood, Salabeno, all that, those are stories made up for dumb people. Dumb people of the 14th century. They had to be told in a language that they could understand. Okay. And he says, now that science has revealed to us what is the truth of nature, we have to believe that. And there is no contradiction. And he kept emphasizing that there is no contradiction between what's there in the scripture, in the Quran, and what science tells us. It's just that you have to throw away certain parts and say that those are stories. Stories not to be believed, but the allegorical, metaphorical, and so forth.
Yeah.
And that create a storm. Oof.
I can bet. I mean, the backlash from the conservative and orthodox Muslims must have been furious.
Well,
Was he proclaimed the Kafir-e-Azam or Kafir?
pretty close to that. He was declared Wajib al-Qatl by the Grand Mufti of Egypt. He was. It said that there were 5,500 fatwas of kufr
On him.
of disbelief on him. I think that's an exaggeration. Anyway, even his close friends started deserting him on that. And what's very interesting is that eventually Sir Syed Ahmad Khan banned his own books.
That's right. That's the most interesting part I read in your book. That in what was the Mohammedan Oriental school or college that he started,
MAO College.
MAO College that became Aligarh University later on, in order to make peace with these conservative and orthodox Muslims, he said, my theology will not be taught there. Your theology, you come and teach your theology. So it was a very interesting, I suppose, you might say a pragmatic, practical compromise, if you're being generous to him, so that at least the main work of modern education can continue without getting distracted by theological arguments. Would you see it that way?
I would see it that way. I would see that he was a person who made compromises and sometimes very wise compromises. So, for example, at Aligarh, okay, a lot of his Sunni support disappeared when he said that we will give Shia students also admission into this college. They said, but how can you allow these Shia Sunni difference was huge at that time. It hasn't quite gone away either. How can you allow them over here? And he said, there will be Hindus over here as well. So in Aligarh Muslim University, you had Hindus, Hindu teachers, Hindu students, and they would all take benefit from that. Furthermore, this is also very interesting. He banned cow slaughter in the precincts. He didn't say it's to be banned for all of India, but it's banned from the college premises.
In deference to his students and the teachers.
Yes.
I mean, his task was monumental, Dr. Saab, because, I mean, when I see MA school or when it's found, of the 50, 60 teachers he had to go hire, he couldn't hire one Muslim teacher. They were either British or Hindu teachers. There was no Muslim teacher who could teach modern subjects to the Muslims. So, I mean, his task of trying to reform and open the minds of a whole vast community was horrendous. And he took a lot of personal risk in trying to do that.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Aligarh where difficulty was. There was this in UP Roorkee, I think, a place over there. There's an institute of technology there, and they had books translated from English into Urdu. It was those were technical books, of course, and of the 50 books which were translated, became textbooks. I think only one or two of them was done by a Muslim translator. The others were all Hindu. The Hindus were translating from English into Urdu. It's because even for the purposes of translation, the Muslims were not available over there. So there was a generational problem over here. From the time of the Mughals down there to Sir Syed's time, 1860, 70, 80, 90, and then it continued.
I mean, to put it in stark terms, if you will, the Hindu majority had almost 100-year start on modernization from, let's say, middle of the 18th century to the Muslims who Sir Syed begins to introduce to modern education in the middle of the 19th century or afterward. So there was the gap between what they had learned in this generation. That would be 4 generations. I mean, there was a huge gap between that opened up between Muslims and Hindus as a result of modernity.
Absolutely, and this is the point that I make in my book over here, that the two-nation theory actually comes from this. Had we emphasized modern knowledge, the differences would never have come to this point where Muslims would feel intensely disadvantaged in a united India. Now, this could have been handled differently, but that's another subject.
That's right. So coming to the end of on Sir Syed, from the vantage point of history, looking back 200 years, what would be your concluding thoughts on Sir Syed?
Oh, I'd say that he was a remarkable man, and remarkably far-sighted, knows the way that Muslims need to go, emphasizes it, rewrites Muslim theology, and yet he cannot get out of his way of thinking that the British are here to stay forever, that we need to serve them, that the betterment of Muslims, the betterment of India for that matter, lies in the preservation of colonial rule. He was also, as we discussed, somebody who was not friendly to the idea of women's liberation, did not think of of women as being equal human beings. He had his set of ethnic prejudices, particularly on Bengalis. So look, it's mixed. And yet I think that among all of Pakistan's founder heroes, I think he was the most enlightened because he saw the future that way. And let me finally say that nowhere in the Muslim world, not Rashid Rida, not Muhammad Abdul, not Zia Gokul in Turkey, nowhere do you find someone who's made this effort to reformulate Muslim thinking on science, particularly on science. So, in that sense, I think he's absolutely unique. He has his minuses, but he has this big plus. And I don't think Muslims are going to produce another bold thinker like him for a very long time. Look at our Javed Ghamidi, the poor fellow is
Hounded out.
He's hounded out of Pakistan, lives somewhere in Malaysia or Dubai or God knows where. But he cannot come over here. He would be slaughtered for simply saying that you don't get, it's not right to kill people for apostasy or for blasphemy or for leaving the religion.
Gandhi, I think, comes maybe from the very similar way of thinking as Sir Syed, where Gandhi may be right now, or maybe even he is less of a radical than Sir Syed was.
Oh, way less of a radical.
Way less of a radical.
And because I was on television with him a couple of times, and we disagreed on the causes of earthquakes. And although he didn't go quite to the extent of saying this is azab-e-ilahi, he said this is a tambi. Tambi means warning. He said, look, it can't be. It's the movement of tectonic plates is a matter for physics. So anyway, that's a separate question. I think Sir Syed is where it peaked of the effort to mesh science with Islam.
With theology, yeah. So this is, we have a lot to be thankful to Sir Syed for all of the generations that followed him. So this ends our discussion, ladies and gentlemen, about Sir Syed. We are discussing part 2 of the book, the 3 founding fathers of Pakistan, and we will take up Allama Iqbal next.